This lecture is about personality, which I also like to call our uniqueness, because it is our personality that makes every individual unique. Probably with the exception of learning, personality is one of those domains that is truly held by psychologists. Psychologists really first developed personality theories and began to understand the relationship between a person's personality and behavior. So for this lecture, I would like to go over some of the major theories of personality and some of the major psychologists who contributed to our current understanding of personality and how we frame it. If you haven't already, please go ahead and open up your PowerPoint on personality. The first slide that you see is a description of what we call the functions of personality. This is a theory of personality that was first developed by a psychologist by the name of Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a personal and professional colleague of Freud's. They eventually had some disagreements that led to a professional fallout, but you're going to see some elements of Jung and Freud together when we talk about personality. Jung was really the first person to really characterize a framework for how we can measure personality. If you take a test based on Jung's original functions, you may end up with a test in which you have a 4-letter personality designation. For instance, ISTP or ENFJ. What these letters designate are each of the functions proposed by Jung. He actually proposed the first 3 functions. These are aspects of personality that are along a continuum. The first one, which is probably well known to you, is extroversion and introversion. You are either an E or an I. Now, depending on the type of test that you take, the test may also tell you what percentage of E or I you are. For instance, someone can be labeled an E, in other words, fall into the extroversion category, but just slightly so. So this person might be extroverted in most situations, but sometimes show characteristics of introversion. So just because you're labeled an E or an I doesn't mean you always display those characteristics. The extroversion-introversion continuum relates to how you relate to others. How you relate to others. Extroverts, or E's, tend to be very expressive and outgoing. They are energized by other people. They often speak before they think, and they prefer to be in the company of others. Extroverts tend to have a lot of friends, they tend to be uninhibited, and they like working in teams. They are very approachable and like meeting new people. Extroverts are really considered to be social butterflies. On the other side are introverts. Introverts are quiet and shy people. They tend to be energized more by ideas and feelings than by other people. They are much more likely to think before they speak, and they don't often share personal information easily. They prefer to be left alone, they prefer a small group of friends, and they tend to be a little bit more inhibited than extroverts. So introverts would prefer a small group, they prefer to work alone, and they tend to be a little bit more introspective. That is, introverts tend to be very much in touch with themselves because they like to be reflective and introspective. On the other hand, extroverts really understand other people because they like to be in constant contact with other people. So extroverts tend to understand what others are feeling at the expense of understanding themselves. Introverts are the opposite. The next of Jung's original functions is the distinction between sensors, represented by an S, and intuitors, represented by an N. This dimension represents how people take in information. Sensors live by their 5 senses. They are interested in what is. They are very concrete. Sensors are realistic, they are practical, and they understand details. They are very down to earth, like evidence and facts, and they tend to be traditional. Intuitives, on the other hand, are more in tune with their hunch or gut feeling when they take in information. They are much more interested in what can be. They're much more imaginative. They tend to look beyond the surface of things. Sometimes it may seem like their head is a little bit in the clouds. They like to live in the future. They tend to be more speculative and theoretical. So sensors may seem to be a little bit more concrete in taking in information, kind of a just the facts ma'am approach, where intuitors are more open to see possibilities when they are taking in information. They can look beyond the simple facts that are presented to them. Jung's original third function is the dimension of thinking and feeling, T and F. This represents how people make decisions. Thinkers, as you can imagine, use logic. They are rational. They use justice. They are objective and somewhat impersonal. Sometimes thinkers, based on the way they make decisions, can be perceived as cold and heartless because they value objectivity. Feelers, on the other hand, use their personal feelings in making decision. They make decisions with their very passionate heart. They are merciful. They will hide the truth so that other people won't be hurt. They tend to be much more subjective in their decision making. So feelers are sometimes labeled as a bleeding heart or as being soft, because in comparison to the cold objective thinkers, feelers value subjectivity and empathy when they have to make a decision. So as we're going through these functions, I want you to think about these characteristics because they have a direct impact on how people relate to others and in what professions people would excel. For instance, if you had a boss or manager at work, would you want to work for a thinker or a feeler? Which one would work best with your own personality traits? This is why it's very common in the workplace to take personality tests, especially if you have to work in a team situation, because we begin to understand how the differences in personality can play out in interpersonal relationships in the workplace. And don't forget the most important interpersonal relationship of all, and that is the relationship between you and your partner. If you are a thinker and your partner is a feeler, when it comes down to making big decisions, like those decisions with respect to children or buying a house or moving or something of that nature, the two of you are going to come at those important decisions from a very different direction. So it's important to understand the differences between people. The fourth function was actually developed by a mother and daughter team and added on to Jung's original 3 functions. This fourth function is called the perceiving, judging dimension. The P's and the J's, perceivers and judgers. This function represents how you order your life in a broad sense. The perceiving, judging function represents how you order your life. People who are judgers are decisive and make decisions quickly. They finish projects easily. They are organized, serious, tend to have routines and schedules, and are quite predictable. They like to get things done as soon as possible. Sometimes they can be a little bit overly responsible. Perceivers, on the other hand, are much more flexible and relaxed. They are better able to adapt to situations, especially when situations change. They also tend to be more disorganized, spontaneous, and unpredictable. They like surprises, they like to engage in whatever comes up, and they tend to be a little bit more leisurely. So perceivers tend to be a little bit open-minded, but sometimes that can lead to procrastination and irresponsibility. So that fourth function represents how you order or organize your life as a perceiver or a judger. These functions of personality are used as a foundation for several personality tests. Two common ones are the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, that's abbreviated MBTI, and the Keirsey Temperament Sorter. Both of these tests are very commonly given in the workplace, and if you take a look at the next slide, you will see the designations of the Keirsey Temperament Sorter. If you've ever taken this test, not only will you get your four-letter designation as to your personality type, but Keirsey took those personality combinations and put them into categories. The first category is called the artisan. These are people who have S and P in their personality designation. And as you can see, there are subtypes of artisans. There are many websites out there that describe the characteristics of each of those subtypes: the promoter, the crafter, the performer, and the composer. In the next box, you see people who have N and T in their function designation. These are known as the rationals: the field marshal, the mastermind, the inventor, and the architect. As you can see, both artisans and rationals don't comprise a large percentage of the population. Usually the artisans are about 6% on average. The rationals, if you look at those values, about 4% or so, each of those subtypes. Probably the most common subtype, according to the Keirsey sorter, is the guardian. These are people who have S and J in their personality designation. Here we have the supervisor, the inspector, the provider, and the protector. Notice these percentages are a little bit higher. And then lastly, we have the idealists, represented by having an N and an F in your personality function. The teachers, counselors, champions, and healers. And these percentages are a little bit lower, again, roughly somewhere between 3 and 4%. The champions are a little bit higher. So if you've taken one of these personality tests, you can see where you fall in terms of how the population has a distribution of these different personality types, and just how common yours is or isn't. If you take a look at the next slide, I want to talk about another way in which personality is characterized. Instead of 4 functions, another team of researchers, after doing extensive testing on many subjects, decided that people's personality can be broken down into 5 basic factors. They believed that these factors were enduring. In other words, how you score on these big 5 personality measures represent your enduring personality traits. That is different from how we act from time to time in certain situations. That would be our personality states. Of course, we can change our personality to suit different situations that we are in. But in terms of our enduring personality traits, some researchers believe that these big 5 really capture the essence of an individual. If you look at the list on the slide, you will see the big 5. In no particular order, we have openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. If you look down that list and go by the first letters of each of those, you'll notice that the big 5 make up the acronym OCEAN. If you rearrange those words, you can also go by canoe. But either way, you won't forget the big 5 because you have 2 acronyms that are very easy to remember. So what I want to do next is take a look at each of these big 5 factors and take a look at characteristics of people who would score low and high on each of these factors. If you take a look at the next slide, you will see the first 2 of the big 5 factors represented. The first one is openness. This represents the extent to which you are willing to tolerate and explore the unfamiliar. If you look on the left of this table, people who would score high on openness are creative, original, curious, and adventurous. They're open to pretty much anything. They would be happy to try skydiving one day, bungee jumping the next, learning a foreign language in another country the next. They're up for it. As you can imagine, people who would score low on openness tend to be very conventional and unoriginal. People who are low on O like routines, predictability, schedules. They are not necessarily very adventurous people. So I want you to think to yourself, where do you think you would fall along the continuum for openness? The next one is conscientiousness. And this is the extent to which a person is organized, motivated, and goal-directed. People who are high C's, high conscientiousness, are organized, neat, achievement-oriented, disciplined, reliable, and dependable. A person who is a high C is the person that you would call if you need a ride somewhere, or if your car broke down and you need a lift somewhere, or you need a favor that has to get done. You're going to depend on someone who is a high C. On the other hand, the low C is someone who is unreliable, lazy, essentially irresponsible. This is someone who might be a friend of yours, but probably not someone you're going to call if you need bond money to get out of jail. Not the person who is a low C. This is not someone who you can depend on. If you take a look at the next slide, you'll see the remaining 3 of the big 5 factors. Extroversion, we've already covered when we talked about Jung's functions. So this is the need for stimulation, especially from the outside world. People who are high E's need a lot of external stimulation or stimulation from others. People who are low E's tend to be more withdrawn. In other words, they're more introverted. They don't need a lot of external stimulation to be happy. The next factor is agreeableness. And this is the extent to which a person is essentially nice. There's no better way to say it. How nice is this person? A person who is a high A is a good-natured, accommodating, compliant person. In other words, a high A is simply a nice person. Someone who is a low A is a mean person. They tend to be rude and uncooperative, and sometimes it would appear that they're that way just for the sake of being that way. So probably in your lifetime you've come across some high A's and some low A's, and maybe we should reconsider that as big A's because that would be someone who is low on agreeableness. People who are very rude fairly consistently. The last of the big 5 is neuroticism. Neuroticism is the extent to which you experience anxiety or psychological distress. A person who is a high N, high neuroticism, tends to be a worrier, very insecure, nervous, self-conscious, jealous, all of those negative anxiety-related personality traits. A person who is low on neuroticism is emotionally secure, stable, and relaxed. So depending on how you score on the N factor will in some ways dictate how you respond to a crisis or a stressful situation. High N's are not going to respond well. Low N's have a better chance of responding well to that situation. So again, apply these to yourself and to people you know. Are you a high N? Are you a chronic worrier? If so, do you know people who are low Ns who might be able to help you relax and put things in perspective? Sometimes it helps to surround yourself with people who have an opposite trait if the trait that you have can become self-handicapping. If you take a look at the next slide, you'll see a summary of the Big Five just presented in a table and a figure. So again, this summarizes neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, the Big Five personality traits. For the next slide, we are going to visit one of the people who is most well known in psychology, and that is Sigmund Freud. Freud made a lot of contributions to developmental theory in psychology, but he also made significant contributions to the theory of personality. So we call his theory of personality, unlike the four functions or the Big Five, we call Freud's theory the psychodynamic theory of personality. Freud's model is different from the ones that we've discussed so far, because in Freud's model, he actually has a representation for our levels of awareness. Mapped over the levels of awareness is the actual structure of our personality. So in order to best describe this, I'd like for you to go to the next slide. On the next slide, you will see the most common metaphor for Freud's psychodynamic theory of personality, and that is an iceberg. According to Freud, we have conscious awareness above the surface. That is the part you can see above the surface, much like an iceberg. You can see some of it above the surface of the water, but much of what is going on is actually beneath the surface. So if you take a look on the right side of this diagram, you will see that we have three levels of awareness, or three levels of consciousness. Conscious awareness is our contact with the outside world, our dealings with people and events around us. Just below that surface, just below conscious awareness, is our preconscious mind. According to Freud, in our conscious mind, we have lots of activity going on, lots of cognitive processing going on based on the events and the people around us. But just below that, we have the preconscious mind. And in the preconscious mind is information that isn't immediately available to us, but simmers just below the surface. So in other words, if I had to pull up or recall some information, it's probably sitting in my preconscious mind. I can access it, but I'd have to think about it for a second. Below the preconscious mind is the unconscious mind. And according to Freud, on a daily basis, we do not have access to our unconscious mind. Our unconscious mind is where we have thoughts, desires, and conflict that may drive our behavior, but we are not necessarily consciously aware of them. According to Freud, a lot of information in our unconscious mind comes from our experiences as children. So there may be some residual conflict or anxiety that we don't even think about, but it is still buried and represented deep in our unconscious mind. The reason why I wanted to go over these three levels is because in the middle and left side of this diagram, you see Freud's three components of personality. And according to Freud, these three components are what drives our behavior through our personality. The first part of the structure that I want you to know is the ego. Notice the ego spans the conscious and preconscious minds. The ego is our rational, realistic part of personality. It operates under what Freud called the reality principle. The ego understands what we can and cannot do in a given situation based on rational thought. For instance, you can't just simply drive down the wrong side of the road because you feel like it. That is not rational. That is not part of the reality principle. So the ego keeps our day-to-day behavior and our day-to-day personality in check based on reality checking. The ego goes between the two other components of our personality. The first one I want to mention is the id. Notice the id is buried deep in the unconscious mind. The id is that childlike, instinct-driven part of our personality. The id operates based on the pleasure principle. The idea of, I want this now, I'm going to do this now, I don't care who or what it affects. So think of the id as your little inner child, your little inner 2-year-old. Sometimes the id is conceptualized as a little devil sitting inside saying, I don't care what anybody says or does or how it affects anybody, I want this, I want to do this. So the id is driven by the unconscious mind, because the unconscious mind may not want to go to the doctor's office, because going to the doctor's office means being poked and prodded. So on a realistic level, the ego's saying, come on, you have to go to the doctor, it's important to get checked out. And the id is stomping its feet saying, no, I don't want to go. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to lose your car keys. And it's always interesting that when we have to go somewhere that we don't want to go, that's when we end up not being able to find our keys or our wallet or our phone or something else important to us. That is the id's way of saying, we're not going to do this, and I am going to influence your behavior, even if you're not necessarily consciously aware of it. Now, on the other side of things is what Freud called the superego. The superego is that part of our personality that is driven by morality, what we should do, how we should be good, how we should help others. So the ego has to balance between the little id on one side, stomping its feet and wanting to do whatever it wants to do, and the superego, which is very moral and says, you know, I'm exhausted, I worked 18 hours today, but you know what, I still need to go help so-and-so because it's the right thing to do, because I should. That's the superego talking. So the superego is almost like the little angel sitting on the other shoulder. Personality problems derive from an imbalance between the superego and the id. Sometimes people are a little bit more id-driven. You might know people like this. And sometimes people are a little bit more superego-driven. You might also know people like this. So it is the job of the ego to balance these two sides of personality with reality, to balance the wants and desires of the id, and also to balance the need to be good and moral and virtuous on the superego side. Now, sometimes, according to Freud, the ego has to use what are called defense mechanisms to justify the wants and needs of the id, or to shut down the wants and needs of the id. So in other words, to make us feel better about ourselves and for our ego to feel satisfied, sometimes we engage in what are called defense mechanisms. If you take a look at the next slide, you'll see the most commonly used defense mechanisms. So I want to go through each of these, and then we're going to do a little exercise just to practice matching situations with the defense mechanism that gets used. The first one is called repression. Repression is exactly what it says it is. This is when we bury our feelings deep down into our unconscious mind, usually because they're not appropriate. If they're id-driven, they're probably not appropriate. So, for example, a traumatized soldier has no recollection of the details of a close brush with death. In other words, this memory is so traumatizing and the soldier does not want to deal with it that the simplest answer is to bury that memory. So repression is when we actually bury the memory of an undesirable experience or event. That will keep the ego satisfied because we don't have to go through something that we don't want to go through. The next one is projection. Projection is when you attribute your own thoughts, feelings, or motives onto somebody else. The easiest way to think about projection is to think of it as the "it's not me, it's you" situation. In other words, you may have a feeling or a thought that you really don't want to have, so you say, no, I'm fine with it. You're the problem. You're the issue. You're the one who has it in for me, whatever the case may be. So, for example, a woman who dislikes her boss thinks she likes her boss, but feels that the boss doesn't like her. Again, the scenario of, I should like my boss, but unconsciously I don't like my boss. So if there's conflict, she would say, oh no, I think you're fine. I just get the sense that you don't like me. I like you just fine. You just don't like me. The next one is displacement, probably the most common defense mechanism out there. This is when we take the emotion that we feel and we apply it to a substitute target. So if you look at the example, after scolding, a young girl takes her anger out on her little brother. Displacement is one of the most common defense mechanisms. If we're angry at something or angry at someone, sometimes it is not appropriate to take our anger and frustration out on that actual target. So as a result, we displace onto a substitute target that is more appropriate, although this person usually ends up being the victim of anger that he or she did not deserve. The next defense mechanism is a little bit harder to understand, but a very important one. This one is called reaction formation. This is when someone behaves in a way that is exactly the opposite of how he or she truly feels. So, for example, a parent who unconsciously resents a child spoils the child with outlandish gifts. Because it's not appropriate for a parent to feel resentment toward a child, the parent goes overboard in the other extreme and behaves in the exact opposite way. Another example of this, if we take it back to a childhood scenario, would be a little boy who likes a little girl but ends up kicking her on the playground or says mean things to her on the playground. And you think, well, wait a minute, if you like this little girl, why are you being mean to her? That's reaction formation, because the little boy doesn't want to necessarily admit that he likes her, so he behaves in the exact opposite way of his true feelings. The next defense mechanism is fairly straightforward. It's called regression, and this is when we revert to immature, childlike behavior patterns. So an adult has a temper tantrum when he doesn't get his way. This is not an appropriate way to respond to a situation, but again, it makes the id happy because the id is able to fully express itself and have a full-on temper tantrum. The last one is called rationalization, and the textbook definition in psychology is when we create false but plausible excuses to justify unacceptable behavior. And as you can imagine, rationalization is another very common defense mechanism. We rationalize all the time. So for the example, a student watches TV instead of studying, saying that additional study wouldn't do any good anyway. So she is rationalizing her behavior by simply saying, well, it doesn't matter now, it's out of my hands, so why bother? What I'd like for you to do is leave this slide open, and I'm going to read some examples of scenarios, and I want you to be able to identify which defense mechanism is at work here. So I'm going to read it, pause for a few seconds, and then give you the answer. Okay, here's the first one. Jan really doesn't like her in-laws, but goes out of her way to take them out for nice birthday dinners. Jan really doesn't like her in-laws, but she goes out of her way to take them out for nice birthday dinners. This is an example of reaction formation. Again, acting in a way that is opposite of one's true feelings to appease the ego. Here's another one. Sarah slams the door to the classroom after failing an exam. Sarah slams the door to the classroom after failing an exam. This is an example of displacement. She is angry at either herself or the professor or both, but she takes it out on a door by slamming it. So that is displacement. 2 years after breaking up with Rick, Julie fails to even recognize him at a party. 2 years after breaking up with Rick, Julie fails to even recognize him at a party. This is repression, keeping thoughts and feelings that are distressing buried deep, to the point where Julie doesn't even recognize Rick anymore. At the slightest sign of illness, Tom curls up in bed with his favorite blanket and pouts. At the slightest sign of illness, Tom curls up in bed with his favorite blanket and pouts. I think this one is pretty straightforward. This is an example of regression, where we regress to immature, childlike behavior patterns. Okay, how about this one? Diane, who thinks Sam is in love with her, probably has secret desires for Sam. Diane, who thinks Sam is in love with her, probably has secret desires for Sam. This is an example of projection. In other words, Diane thinks that Sam is in love with her, but probably she has those feelings for Sam. So she is projecting her own feelings onto someone else. Okay, let's try one more. An employee was fired from his job and told his friends he was getting ready to quit anyway. An employee was fired from his job and told his friends he was getting ready to quit anyway. If that is not a more clear-cut example of rationalization, I don't know what is. We rationalize our behaviors. It is a plausible but false excuse to justify our behaviors. So the last one was rationalization. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk briefly about another personality theorist. If you haven't already begun to see this, we have a lot of personality theorists. Alfred Adler was another contemporary of Freud's. Freud had a pretty big circle. Jung was among them, Adler was among them, in addition to some other noteworthy psychologists. Much like Jung, Adler and Freud were originally good friends and good professional colleagues, but Adler eventually went on his own way and developed a lot of his own theories. So what I want to mention here are Adler's theories regarding personality. Adler believed that our source of motivation was to achieve. Personality is driven by our need and desire to achieve. I'm putting it in this context because it will explain his two major theories regarding personality. The first one is the idea of overcompensation. As a personality characteristic, sometimes people are driven by the experience of inferiority, when you feel that you do not measure up somehow to some standard among others or your peers. So sometimes we can develop what's called an inferiority complex. And unfortunately, our inferiority complex can cause us to engage in overcompensation. So in other words, your personality can be dominated by this inferiority complex, but then how it manifests can vary. Let's say growing up that you never had a Christmas tree. Every year your friends, your family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, everybody had a Christmas tree but you. It would be appropriate as an adult then to make sure that every year you had a Christmas tree because it became that important to you. That would be considered compensation. I had this lack growing up. I had a deficit. So now I'm going to compensate by making sure I have this thing in place from now on. That's known as compensation, and that's perfectly healthy. Someone who overcompensates would make sure to get the biggest, most ridiculous tree every year just because he or she did not have a tree growing up. That's taking it a little too far, and that is what we refer to as overcompensation. This is going above and beyond what would be considered adequate as a result of one's inferiority complex. So the inferiority complex can be a powerful motivator and a powerful part of our personality. Adler's other major contribution to personality theory is the relationship between birth order and subsequent personality. A lot of research has been done on how your birth order, in other words, if you have brothers and sisters, what order are you in among your siblings, how that can affect your subsequent personality as an adult. According to Adler, if you are an only child, your personality characteristics are going to be different from people who grew up with siblings. As an only child, you like being the center of adult attention. Well, as a child, you like being the center of adult attention. You have difficulty sharing. This will continue and persist into adulthood. From a very early age, you preferred adult company and used adult language. In other words, you grew up faster relative to your same age peers. Because there were no other children in the household, you kind of had to accelerate so that you could be a participating member of adult company, namely your parents. Only children can be overprotected and spoiled when they were growing up because there was only one of you, and that personality trait may persist into adulthood. If you are among siblings the oldest child, you may be more authoritarian or strict. The expectations from your parents were very high. You were the oldest. You were expected to set an example. So oldest children tend to be given more responsibility than their younger siblings at an earlier age. Oldest children may resent their younger siblings because essentially oldest children are dethroned by younger siblings. For a while, the oldest child was the only, and then suddenly when brothers and sisters come along, they are no longer the center of attention. So as a general personality trait, because oldest children were given more responsibility and expected to set an example, they may be a little bit more strict, but they also may be a little bit more responsible as adults. Second or middle children are traditionally thought of as being lost children. They don't have the position that the oldest child does, who is almost like a mini parent, and they're not exactly the baby or the youngest child either. So it is fairly common that middles will be a little bit more competitive. Middles may decide to rebel or try to outdo everyone else. However, another potential manifestation for middle children is to become sort of lost. In other words, he or she might have trouble finding their way in the world, deciding what it is they want to be when they grow up, because they were just sort of lost in the mix when they were growing up. They weren't expected to set an example, and they weren't overly spoiled like the babies are too. So middle children can go one of two ways. They can either be overly competitive, especially with their older brothers or sisters, or they may just become essentially drifters, having a much more difficult time establishing their identity, future career paths, and what they want out of life. According to Adler, the youngest children are the babies. Youngest children have many mothers and fathers, because with the youngest children, it's not just necessarily the mothers and fathers taking care of them, but also older brothers and sisters. So they have a lot of people telling them what to do, trying to educate them and teach them. As a result, youngest children may end up being lost, much like the middles, because they're used to having people tell them what to do. Youngest children never have to find their own way because there's always hand-me-down clothes, hand-me-down cars, hand-me-down this, hand-me-down that. So they really didn't have to pave their own way. Everything was essentially given to them. Youngest children will always be the babies. Parents usually still think of them as babies, even well into adulthood, because they're usually the last ones to leave the nest. So youngest children may get a little bit of preferential treatment from the parents that they did not give to the oldest or the middles. Unfortunately, that preferential treatment can result in the expectation of preferential treatment by people at work, by significant others, whoever they come in contact with. So as you can see, it is quite possible that your simple birth order can affect certain elements of your personality. So I want you to take a minute when you get a chance and just reflect on whether or not your birth order affects aspects of your personality. One thing you have to remember is that Adler's theories were from the 1950s, I believe. So you have to keep in mind that his theories were based on our traditional nuclear family structure. And in today's world, that's not necessarily a reality. Many people do not come from traditional family structures. So it might be hard for you to identify, okay, where in this family structure would I be? Because I have step-siblings and half-siblings. So you just have to take Adler's findings with a grain of salt. But just think about where you would most likely fit among his different birth orders and try and determine whether or not that affects your personality and how you go through life. There's one more person that I would like to mention with respect to personality theory. So if you go to the next slide, you're going to see a picture that is familiar to all beginning psychology students. This is Abraham Maslow's theory of personality. His theory of personality, like Freud's, is radically different from personality theories that I've mentioned so far. Maslow believed that our motivation, what really drives our personality, is to become the best person we can be. Simply put, our motivation and the foundation for our personality is our desire to be the best person we can be. Abraham Maslow was a humanistic psychologist. And if you remember, humanistic psychologists say that people strive to be the best they can be. Humanists see the inherent good in people and want to see people blossom into their full potential. So according to Maslow, all humans strive to be the best person that they can be. But before we can get to that peak, as you can see on this slide, his theory of personality is represented by a pyramid, what we call a hierarchy. This hierarchy starts at the very bottom with basic needs that must be met for everybody. And then as we go up through this hierarchy, fewer and fewer people will reach those increasing levels. So this pyramid is called the hierarchy of needs. And as you can see from the descriptions on the left, each level represents a different need. Some people will get through all of those needs, some people will not. It depends on where you are in life and what your current needs are. So in order to become the best person you can be, to realize your full potential, all of those other needs below it must be met first. So if you take a look at this hierarchy, the bottom of the pyramid, the very base, represents physiological needs. So at the bottom of the pyramid is everybody, because everybody needs to satisfy hunger, thirst, shelter. Basic needs. If you cannot have those needs met on a regular basis, there is no way that you're going to progress up through the higher needs. So everybody starts out with meeting physiological needs. Again, hunger, thirst, warmth, shelter, those kinds of needs, basic human needs. Once those are met, in the pyramid or hierarchy, the next level up is safety and security. So have you met the need for long-term survival and stability? Are you in a stable home environment? Are you in a stable work environment? Do you have a stable car? And all of these things that we take for granted, but these are basic fundamental needs. If you rely on these things, those needs must be met before you can progress higher. So pretty much the cognitive sense of safety and security, along with physiological needs, must be met before you go to the next level. The next level is belongingness and love needs. So Maslow describes that as affiliation and acceptance, that you are part of a group and that you are loved by others. Conversely, you are able to give love to others. And what we really mean here are significant others and close family members. If you are hungry and homeless, it is very difficult for you to have those needs met and to help others meet those needs as well. If your primary motivation is to have someplace warm to stay at night, it is very difficult for you to concentrate on belongingness and love needs. That is why the hierarchy is shaped the way it is. Not everyone will get to that level because they have to concern themselves first with those lower needs. So presumably the majority of people will get to belongingness and love needs, have those fulfilled, which enables them to move up to the next level, which is esteem needs. According to Maslow, people need to recognize their sense of achievement and gain recognition from others. Now, sometimes that satisfaction of achievement can come from within. Some people might say, I don't need to be recognized by others. I just need to feel like I've done a good job. That's fine. That meets your esteem needs. But again, you can't be winning an award for something that you did if you don't have any social support system, you're not in a stable environment, and you're hungry. So you see how the hierarchy goes. These higher needs cannot be met until the lower ones are met first. As we go up the hierarchy, the next one is cognitive needs, which anyone listening to this lecture should be having right now. Cognitive need, that is the need for knowledge and understanding. Every college student should be having experience with a cognitive need. But think about it. Are all of those needs below cognitive being met for you right now? According to Maslow, if those lower needs are not being met and you're taking college classes, something isn't going to work. Those lower needs are going to end up being a higher priority and you will not be able to focus on your cognitive need. the lower needs must be met first. As we move up to the hierarchy, almost near the top, we have aesthetic needs. That's the need for order and beauty. These are needs that are really uniquely human. The need to appreciate culture, art, music, even something like organization, a well-organized space, can be very aesthetically pleasing. So anything artistic, anything creative, anything that conjures up a sense of appreciation for the beautiful and the orderly, those would meet our aesthetic needs. Again, some people need them more than others. Some people value them more than others. But according to Maslow, it is a need. This is a uniquely human need. And then at the peak of the hierarchy, Maslow believes that only a very small percentage of people reach this top part of the hierarchy, and they are able to meet their need for self-actualization. Self-actualization is when a person reaches or fulfills his or her highest potential. When you reach your full potential, you are said to be self-actualized. According to Maslow, only about 2% of people reach that top part of the hierarchy. Only a very, very, very small percentage of people ever reach self-actualization. And when he gave examples of people who he believed were self-actualized, he actually had to look back in history. It wasn't necessarily Joe Schmo. It was people like Lincoln, Kennedy, Gandhi, Jesus. I'm trying to think. I think there are others out there. But these are people who are very noteworthy in history in terms of reaching their full potential. If you take a look at the next slide, there are some characteristics of people who are believed to be self-actualized. These are personality traits, according to Maslow, of someone who has reached the level of self-actualization. So, people who are self-actualized live in reality. They tend to be spontaneous yet simple. They feel like they are mission-driven in life. They are part of something bigger, and that something bigger drives them to do things. They have a need for privacy, which is interesting. They have to keep a part of themselves to themselves. They are autonomous and can work independently. They have a continued freshness of appreciation, so they can see beauty in small things. They have mystical and peak experiences. I'll get back to that in just a moment. They have feelings of identification with the human race. In other words, they feel like they are part of something bigger than themselves. Self-actualized people have strong friendships, but limited number of friendships. In other words, these are people who maybe have one best friend, or two best friends, and then lots of acquaintances, or lots of good friends. But this is not someone who has 100 best friends and has 1,000 friends on Facebook whom they would all consider to be close friends. People who are self-actualized are democratic, they are ethical, they have an unhostile sense of humor. So I'm sorry to say, but people who tend to use sarcasm, you're out. Sarcasm is a hostile sense of humor. This is not consistent with someone who is self-actualized. I'm sorry if that takes you out of the running. And self-actualized people are balanced. Let me go back for a second to the idea of peak experiences. According to Maslow, some people will experience an event that transforms them or makes them feel, for a lack of better description, as if they are one with the universe, one with the entire human race. It might be climbing to the top of a mountain. It might be experiencing the birth of a child. It might be being in the middle of a crowd somewhere celebrating something. but you have this very distinct experience where you feel this kinship with other people, again, feeling like a sense of oneness with the universe, and that is a peak experience. Not only do self-actualized people have peak experiences, but they can recognize them for what they are. That they are essentially a miracle. That they are essentially a once-in-a-lifetime event that they can draw upon as part of their daily existence. So again, if you think about Maslow's theory of personality as a hierarchy, our personality is driven by our desire to become the best person that we can be, but that requires achieving those different needs. Not everyone is going to get to the top need, and if one of the lower needs becomes urgent, then we will regress. We will actually go back down the hierarchy until we can address that lower need. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about how we assess personality. So far, we did talk about one kind of personality test. That is a test that's based on Jung's 4 functions. So if you take a look at the next slide, you will see that one way to assess personality is through the use of questionnaires. The MBTI, or Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, is similar to the Jung test and the Keirsey Temperament Sorter. These all test for the 4 functions. They all have the foundation in the 4 functions of personality. But before I get to the other most popular questionnaire, I'd like to talk a little bit about projective tests. Projective tests are personality tests that require you to project certain characteristics of your personality. They are meant to be vague and diffuse on purpose. There are no right or wrong answers, but sometimes a certain answer can reveal certain elements of your personality. Probably one of the most famous psychology tests out there is called the Rorschach Inkblot test. There's a website that I have listed that goes through the different ink blots. There are 10 standard ink blots. More recently, Wikipedia released the interpretations of the ink blots, which was not very well received by psychologists because scoring them requires people to be naive about what they're supposed to say about each of the ink blots. If you take a look at the next slide, you're going to see a progression of 3 representative ink blots. The first one is in color, and it doesn't necessarily represent anything in particular. There is no common response to this ink blot. Some people say it looks like the orange part looks like 2 people, maybe, but it is vague on purpose. Sometimes people who show a delay in just trying to identify what is on this particular ink blot may indicate trouble with dealing with uncertainty. But other than that, there really isn't anything distinctive about this blot. It is meant to be vague on purpose. The second one, you may think, well, maybe it looks like 2 people beating on drums or something like that. The way that people respond to this card may give hints as to how people relate with other people, how they interact socially. And if you take a look at the third slide, this is a very common slide shown as a representative ink blot. This one is generally perceived as being an animal hide or a skin or a rug. It is usually somewhat threatening because the position almost makes you feel as if you are looking up to it, and sometimes that elicits a sense of responding to authority. This ink blot is almost universally responded to as male rather than female, and you might say that's because there is something somewhat phallic looking between its, quote, legs. So those are some of the common responses to those ink blots. But like I said, There are no set responses, and the psychologist has a big book of interpretations for each of these ink blots and how you respond to them and how it can possibly reveal aspects of your personality. The next projective test that I want you to know is called the TAT, or Thematic Apperception Test. This test requires people to look at a picture, again one that is vague on purpose, and make up a story as to what is happening in this picture. In other words, what's going on. So of course there are aspects of creativity that come into the TAT assessment, but also it's what you say, what kind of story you construct that may reveal certain aspects of your personality. So if you go to the slide after the ink blots, you are going to see in progression 3 examples of just vague pictures. The first one is of an old woman and a young woman. This is one of the classic TAT examples. And your job is to create a story about what is happening in this picture. What's the young woman thinking about? Why is the older woman there? What's going on? The second picture is of a man and a woman having what appears to be drinks at an outdoor cafe. So your job again is to create a story as to what is happening. Some people will come up with stories that are very innocent. Some people will come up with stories that are not very innocent. Some people will look at the drinks on the table and may find it a little bit odd as to the placement. Some people might say, well, there's a third person there, but they've left to go to the restroom or make a call. Who's to say? The bottom line is it's up to you to make up a story as to what's happening. Same thing with the third example. Again, vague on purpose. We see 2 men and a woman talking. They appear to be in business attire. So you can have some fun with making up whatever story you'd like to make up about what is going on in this image. But again, what you say is going on will help reveal certain aspects of your personality, because in theory you are projecting elements of your personality onto these images. So projective tests have that in common. Because they are nonspecific on purpose, you end up projecting aspects of your personality onto the test material. The last projective test that I want you to know is on the next slide, and that is called the sentence completion test. And as you go through each of these, what you will find is that these are simply open-ended statements. And your job is to fill in the rest of that open-ended statement. So we have, I secretly wish, ... In the evening, ... Men, ... And so on. In the sentence completion test, there are approximately 28 items. So where you see men, ... Later on in the test, there is the same statement that just starts with women. So it is balanced with respect to gender, but it does cover a wide range of topics. And again, with you filling in these sentences, you are projecting aspects of your personality, and a lot of those aspects of your personality may come from past experiences and current impressions and perceptions about what's going on around you. So that's the purpose of the sentence completion test. So you see, for example, when I was younger, that refers to your experiences or your perceptions when you were younger. The last test that I want you to know is another type of questionnaire, and this starts on the next slide. If you have taken this test called the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, you will know it, because this test has over 500 questions. This is not a 5-minute personality test. It is a very common test given by employers, but it does take a long time to complete. Commonly, people who work for government, people who work in law enforcement, and of course, people who are going to be in organizations or agencies in which there is a lot of counseling going on would be required to take the MMPI. The MMPI is a very unique test. It measures certain aspects of your personality with many different subscales. So I'm going to show you the subscales in a minute, but I just want to show you some examples of items from different subscales. One of the subscales is depression. So a sample item might be, I usually feel that life is worthwhile and interesting. So you're going to either answer true or false to that statement. Another subscale is paranoia. Evil people are trying to influence my mind. Another subscale is schizophrenia, a psychological disorder. I seem to hear things that other people can't hear. So, scores are taken for each of these subscales, and the MMPI will then assess the extent to which a person has personality characteristics that may border on disordered. That is what the MMPI does. Its goal is to find where you have personality traits that may border on disorder. Because if an employer is giving you this test, it is up to them to make sure that you are fit for the job. If you take a look at the next slide, you will see the MMPI clinical subscales. That is what the MMPI is measuring. I certainly don't expect you to know all of these. Some of these are clinically somewhat rare, but there are some that should be easily recognizable to you. One is hypochondriasis, and that is someone's over-concern to the point of being overly anxious about it with respect to bodily symptoms, feeling that you're always sick or about to get sick or having other somatic or bodily complaints. The next subscale is depression, pretty straightforward. Hysteria, that one's not quite as common as depression. Psychopathy, psychopathic deviant. This is something that we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about psychological disorders, but someone who is a psychopathic deviant would show social deviation, a lack of morality, and a lack of respect for authority or the rules of society. Then we have masculinity, femininity, stereotypical masculine or feminine interests or behaviors, paranoia, psychasthenia. This one's a little bit more rare, but it refers back to excessive worry or anxiety. Schizophrenia is odd thinking, also the presence of hallucinations or delusions. Hypomania, mania is the presence of flight of ideas, being irritable and easily excitable, and then social introversion. So don't think that if you score particularly high or low on one of these subscales, it means you have a disorder. These are just the clinical subscales that are measured by the MMPI, and if the scores are extreme, they may potentially indicate a problem. The next slide shows, just for your information, some additional subscales on the MMPI. Because the test is so long, there are built-in lie detectors in the test. In other words, similar types of questions are asked over and over again. So if you are lying, you will probably provide inconsistent answers. So the lie scale is meant to watch for people who are trying to present themselves in a more favorable light. They're lying on their responses. They don't want to admit to symptoms of schizophrenia or symptoms of depression, for example. We have a faking scale where people try to fake good or fake bad, either fake that they are more well than they are, or fake that they are worse than they are. Sometimes that can work to a person's advantage. We have a defensiveness scale, which again is a subtle way of trying to present yourself in a more favorable light. Then we have several scales for inconsistent responding, or not paying attention to the question, or leaving many questions unanswered, which would essentially void the results or invalidate the results of the test. So the MMPI is one of the most comprehensive personality tests out there, but it measures personality traits in a very specific way. Personality traits that may border on disordered personality traits. So as you can see, we have several different theories of personality. There is not simply one way in which our construct or our understanding of personality is understood. We have the 4 functions, we have the Big Five, we have Freud's psychodynamic model, we have Adler's model that includes the inferiority complex and birth order, and then we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Very, very different ways to frame or structure personality theory, but all have been useful in our understanding of what makes us unique. Similarly, there are many different ways to test for our personality traits. One particular test is not necessarily indicative of what our true personality traits are, although we do believe that across our lifespan, especially across the adult lifespan, that our personality traits tend to be stable. That is, if you measure as a high agreeable in your 20s, you are likely to measure as high agreeable in your 40s and 50s. Similarly, if you measure as a thinker on Jung's 4 functions early in adulthood, you will most likely endure as a thinker into later adulthood. The strength of those may change over time, but they are still considered to be part of your enduring personality traits. That's the end of the lecture on personality.